All right, 10th grade. Today we're looking at the reasons and methods of African resistance. First, let's look at kind of like context in a way, but like African colonies themselves. What's going on in these African colonies? Well, first, our first headline, African colonies, settler colonies, and abuse. So we have two different kind of points we're going to try to be making here. First is the similarity to Asia. When we talked about Asia and the colonies of Asia, we talked about how they're colonies of exploitation and how Asians were often treated poorly. This is the same for African colonies. In African colonies, there was a group of elite who were raised, of local elite who were raised up to kind of do the everyday running of the colony. In Africa, these were usually minority tribes or smaller tribes who gained a lot of power under European rule and also relied on Europeans to maintain that power. It also allowed the Europeans to have Africans mad at these minority tribes instead of mad at themselves as rulers. So these elite often had to westernize. They had their kids educated by Europeans. They converted to Christianity. They started to act more European. The idea being is that to maintain this power and to have power in the colonial system, these local elites had to westernize and act European. Not only that, we have the similarities in ideas of how to Europeans, a huge justification for imperialism was converting Africans to Christianity. So Christian missionaries spent a lot of time living amongst Africans, trying to convert them. And within these conversions, Christian missionaries were the ones who were most likely to educate Africans. And so Africans were often educated by Christian missionaries, converted, attempted to be westernized, and basically taught that the African way of life was not as civilized or as good as the European way of life. Last but not least, Africans were abused and treated badly as a way to create wealth. One, by forcing Africans to grow cash crops and collect raw resources, and second, taxed heavily. And once again, this idea of violence as a main method to keep Africans in line. You would never view Africans in these colonies as slaves, though there's many reasons why you can consider them as such, with how they were treated, forced to work, and often extremely subservient to Europeans. What's unique about Africa as opposed to Asia was the prevalence of settler colonies. Now, in Asia, there were two major settler colonies, Australia and New Zealand, both settled by England. But in Africa, we see a lot more of these. The idea of a settler colony is that this is a colony where Europeans move to in fairly large numbers with the goal of owning land, running the colony, and basically starting new lives in these areas, to the point that in some colonies, the Europeans who move there consider themselves Africans. Because they've lived there for so long. But the point of settler colonies is that you have a significant population of Europeans who move there, maintain control, and kind of change the colony to support themselves. So what's unique about settler colonies? Well, first, when the Europeans move to these colonies, Africans are kicked off the best land, immediately removed. There could be any number of reasons given, but Europeans are given the best land, and often large amounts of it, pushing Africans to the worst land. This causes a dependence that the Africans now have. Africans often now have to work for Europeans on their land, in jobs owned by them, in businesses owned by them, as a way to survive. So Africans become very dependent on the Europeans' wealth, which makes them subservient to the Europeans. There are law codes passed that give Europeans more rights than Africans. And overall, it becomes a colony completely centered on making sure this European minority population maintains and keeps their power. Some of our major settler colonies include Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Algeria. So overall, we see Africans face a lot of the same issues that Asians face and are thus going to resist for a lot of the same reasons. A loss of land, extreme abuse by their European colonial rulers, and forced cultural change is going to make them want to resist Europeans. On to our next section, accommodation and resistance. So we're going to look at both how some Africans accommodated to European rule, but also some explicit examples of resistance. So first, accommodation. It was fairly common that Africans viewed the coming of Europeans as a way, as something that they needed to accommodate to. So instead of fighting, they figured out ways to live with it. First, some African kings, rulers, tribes viewed the Europeans as a way for themselves to gain power. Maybe they could side with the Europeans against a rival. Maybe they could secure an agreement where they were the local rulers. or they were the ones that they promised to serve the Europeans in exchange for ruling the area. But overall, there were plenty of African rulers and tribes who actually actively worked with the Europeans to maintain or increase their own power. You also have some Africans that try to work with the Europeans as equals, going into contracts with them, selling land to them, trying to figure out business agreements. Often these agreements ended with the Europeans backstabbing them and abusing those agreements, but the attempt was made. Lastly, there are some African groups who just realized the power of the Europeans immediately. Instead of wasting lives, in their opinion, wasting lives, fighting against it, they just accommodated European rule, immediately pledged themselves as servants to the Europeans, and tried to protect their own interests as much as possible. On the flip side, we did have plenty of Africans who actively resisted the colonization by Europeans. So as the British or French or any other European power appeared, actively fighting against them. So when I mean resistance, I basically mean active fighting against the process of colonization. So let's look at a few examples. First is Samori Toure, or Samori Toure. I'm gonna butcher a lot of these pronunciations, kids. So Samori Toure. He was a Muslim leader in West Africa. Right before the Europeans showed up, specifically the French, right before they showed up, he had formed a fairly large empire in West Africa, conquering a lot of the people around him because he was actually quite aware of the European threat and power. So his goal was to, before the Europeans show up in force, to create a large empire with a strong modern army that he could use to resist the Europeans. He unfortunately didn't have enough time to do this, as by the time the French showed up, he wasn't as prepared as he hoped. This didn't stop Samori and his armies from actively resisting the French. From the period of 1885 to 1895, Samori Toure and his army, buying weapons and trying to upgrade their weapons, actively fought against the French army. They won actually plenty of battles, but the problem was that they could never quite kick the French out, and the French would just resupply and try again. And eventually, Samori's army was defeated and pushed out of West Africa, and he himself was captured. He was held up in West Africa as this resistance figure, though, someone to emulate, and he showed that Africans could defeat Europeans on the field of battle. He just couldn't maintain those successes. One strategy that we talked about yesterday was how the Europeans turned Africans against each other. Well, one reason the French were able to defeat Samori Toure was that they were able to turn African tribes against him, specifically ones that were not Muslim. So already we see early on a way that Europeans colonize Africa is by finding the differences between African tribes and using them against each other. Our next example is, and this is going to be tough for me, Ya Asantawa. Don't laugh at me. It's my best try. She was one of the rulers in Ashanti, which is a West African kingdom. Basically, as the Europeans started showing up, the Ashanti did a really bad job of resisting the European powers. And finally, what it took was Ya to... I was trying to say her name, but I psyched myself out before I tried saying it. But finally, what allowed the Ashanti to actually resist was Ya Ashantewa. She was the first and only African female ruler who was able to lead a resistance force against the Europeans. She basically used the shame of African masculinity, claiming that the men were not masculine enough to actually fight against the Europeans. She was able to actually unite the tribes of the Ashanti and try to forcibly fight the British and prevent their colonization. She ended up failing, but once again, she showed that Africans could win some battles, could resist the Europeans, and basically by 1900, she was defeated. But another example of resistance. Our only successful resistance we see is done by Ethiopia. Ethiopia is in East Africa. It is an old kingdom, one of actually the earliest Christian kingdoms that in existence. But the Ethiopian kingdom had been in existence for a long time, hundreds of years. And the leader of Ethiopia realized that to defeat the Europeans, they needed modern weapons. So he was one of the few Africans who was able to get Maxim guns for his country. He bought a lot of modern weapons. He drilled his armies in modern European warfare, and was able to defeat the Italians when they showed up to try to colonize Ethiopia, being one of the few African leaders to maintain his independence and Ethiopia's independence. Cool, now we're going to look at a couple examples of rebellions. Thanks, babe. We're going to look at a couple examples of rebellions, or examples of groups that rose up after they were colonized. We want to see a couple examples of what they were facing that made them want to rebel. Our first example is the Xhosa cattle killing movement, 1854 to 1858. So this happened in South Africa, as South Africa was colonized way earlier than most of the rest of Africa. But in South Africa, the British were slowly taking land from the Xhosa. The Xhosa's entire livelihood was based on cattle, which requires a lot of land. So as the Europeans were taking more and more land, the Xhosa found it harder and harder to survive. Not only that, they had an issue with disease in their cattle and were losing cattle at a pretty fast rate. So they were basically losing their way of life. They were losing wars to the Europeans. They didn't know what to do. Excuse me. This caused them to turn to a religious prophet. A prophet is someone who speaks with the voice of God often, or has like a religious significance, or is a religious leader. One thing we're going to see is that a lot of these rebellions are often led by prophets or religious leaders, as they promise a way for Africans to return back to the life they knew before the Europeans showed up. So in this case, this prophet states that if the Xhosa follow this prophecy, or this myth, they follow this prophecy of killing all their cattle, then their ancestors would rise up and drive the Europeans off the land. So the Xhosa follow through. They're so desperate that they kill all of their cattle, hoping this prophecy will happen. Well, it doesn't. But and the Xhosa go through a stage of starvation. Many of them die. And the British, instead of doing anything to help the Xhosa, basically encourage this starvation and then take the Xhosa's lands as they die out. So we see it wasn't an effective resistance, or it wasn't an effective rebellion, but the idea is that they're being treated so poorly that they're willing to turn to these prophecies as a way to try to fix their situation. Another example is the Mahdiist Rebellion from 1881 to 1899. The Mahdiist Rebellion occurred in Sudan, which is south of Egypt. The basic background story is that by the 1870s, Egypt had colonized and conquered Egypt. I think I said Egypt twice. Mm-hmm. Thank you. In 1876, England, the British, took over, conquered, and colonized Egypt. As we talked about in yesterday's lecture, that was over the Suez Canal. Well, at the time, Egypt also controlled Sudan. The Egyptians and Sudanese were two different people, but the Egyptians had ruled the Sudanese for a long time. When the British showed up, they created tension within the Sudanese that came to a boil. Specifically, I'm going to flip this too much. Specifically, the English did two things that upset the Sudanese. One, the English tried to spread Christianity. The Sudanese were very Muslim. They were strong followers of Islam and viewed this attempt to convert them to Christianity as an attack on their culture. And second, the English tried to outlaw slavery. Slavery was a very important economically to the Sudanese. And so the Sudanese viewed these as taxes too much and rose up against the English. Specifically, a Sunni Islamic leader declared himself the Mahdi. The easiest way to understand is that the Mahdi in Islamic belief, in Sunni Muslim belief, is someone who, let me look at this specifically, I don't want to mess this up. I wrote this down. The Mahdi is a spiritual leader who will rule before the end of the world and restore justice. So once again, this idea of a prophet and a prophecy that if the Sudanese follow this leader, he will lead them to success. And success was had early on. The Sudanese were able to defeat the English armies, kick them out of Sudan, and lasted for about 18 years until finally, one, the Mahdi died, so the central leader died and created this disunity in the Mahdiist rebellion. Second, the English returned with a much larger and stronger army and finally defeated them. But once again, we see an example of being forced to change and being treated poorly leads to a rebellion against the Europeans. While these rebellions early on don't work, they eventually will, and we're going to see this trend later on in the 1900s. Cool, with that, you're going to end here. You are going to break down the prompt, write a thesis, pick your context, SOD1 document, and put that all in the Google Sheet.